Hello and welcome to episode 189 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. My name is Mark, I'm the Green Tank, and with me as always are my co-hosts, Neelan the Orange Tank.
Hello.
And Kellen the Red Tank. Today we are dipping back into our world-famous Designers series of episodes. We started off with Friedman Fries a couple episodes ago, then followed up with Martin Wallace. And today we are going with Mr. Farm Simulator himself, Uwe Rosenberg. So we'll be doing a deep dive into the games of Uwe. And yeah, that is coming up later. But for now, Neelan, why don't you tell us about the games you've been playing?
The game that I have played, and Mark, we played this together, in fact, is a game called Bosk. This is a beautiful little colorful box all about placing trees and blowing leaves across this landscape. So that might sound a little bit and look a little bit like the game Photosynthesis, but this is a wholly original idea involving standee trees. The way that this game plays is effectively in two phases. The game rulebook really wants to convince you that it's in 4 seasons, but it's definitely in 2 phases, each of which has scoring at the end of them. The first phase of the game is you're placing trees out onto the board. Everyone has 8 trees at their disposal. 2 1s, 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s, and you place them on this grid of intersecting rows and columns, like trails that are crossing the game board. And what you're trying to do, you just place them one by one, simply going around the board. And what you're trying to do is have the most value, the highest value of numbers in each row and column. So that sounds pretty straightforward. We evaluate every row and column, and whoever has the most points in trees in that row or in that column gets the most points. First and second are awarded points. Third is never awarded points. As well as awarding points, that is a setup mostly for the second half of the game, where you're then going to pick one of your trees one at a time, and each tree only gets used once in order to blow these sort of leaf tiles across the landscape. Now, the map underneath the trees is sort of this multicolored land that's divided into regions. And what's going to matter at the end of this phase is how many leaves you have on the top of any given pile in a square of a region. So what that means is that on my turn, I pick one of my trees, and I also pick one of these other number tiles I have. I have all the numbers from 2 to 8, and I can only use each of them once. So I might pick a tree and say, okay, I'm blowing 5 leaves from this tree. Every turn, the wind is blowing in a specific direction, and you place the leaves in a trail leading from the tree across the board. But what that means then is that a subsequent player could then blow leaves on top of your leaves, and now they are the person that is controlling that square. Whoever's controlling the most squares in every region at the end of the phase is going to get points for that region. So there's a little bit of an area control competition. But I think the thing that can't be stressed enough is so much of this depends on your clever placement of the trees in the first round. So you want to have trees that are not positioned, say, too close to the edge of the board, because if you get caught off guard and suddenly the wind is blowing towards that edge, you're not going to be able to place many leaves along that direction. So there is some thought to, okay, I need to have some leaves in multiple directions that are also covering the regions that I want to be competitive in. It's a pretty simple game. That's kind of almost the gist of all the rules, except for how the scoring works. But I had some fun with this. I didn't think it was amazing. It's a pretty light, easygoing, abstract game, but I've enjoyed both my plays of it. Mark, what did you think of it?
I mean, it is gorgeous. I think that's the first and foremost thing to note about it. The trees do look a lot like the photosynthesis trees, and that production was always hailed as really nice. And then the pieces you have, everybody having their individual type of leaf pieces. And the colors are very lush, and so the board is very colorful. The production is great. I was sort of lukewarm on it. It is certainly an abstract game, and usually theme is not really important to me to have come out of a game. I don't really necessarily need to feel like I'm in a field of falling leaves or anything like that. But I don't know if it was something about the disconnect of like the level of production versus how abstract it felt, or the fact that I felt there were some turn order issues. Although turn order issues is maybe too strong of a statement to make, it just felt like a lot of your actions could be undone by players who were going later in turn order than you. And while you have some control of that, it didn't feel like enough. And the fact that you can have turns and turns of area control all undone in the late round. You know, you could spend 2 or 3 early rounds placing your leaves, trying to get area majorities. And then as a function of being early in turn order and also as a function of it just being later in the game, you can have a lot of that stuff undone by 1 or 2 people's placement.
Yeah.
That's not to say the game is by any means feeling broken. It does not at all. And it moves pretty quickly. I just don't know when it comes to abstract games that it's one that I would be super eager to revisit. There aren't going to be many abstract games that are prettier than this one, but when it comes to abstract games, I don't think prettiness is really a huge draw for me. I mean, this might make it a little more appealing for non-gamers, but again, I don't know if this would be the game that I would bring out to non-gamers because of how mean it can be.
It's funny, Mark, because like I don't necessarily come to a different conclusion, which is to say that I think it's fine to good, but when it comes to abstract, if this game was just the abstracted version of this, there's no chance in hell I would have enjoyed or played it. You know, like I just have no interest in engaging in a lot of those pure abstracts. So something about the table presence of this, the feel of it, the look, it did have an appeal. It had an appeal that made me want to get it out. It made me want to try it. I don't think it's one that I'm going to return to just because I don't think the gameplay is strong enough, but yeah. It definitely exists in sort of a realm like Santorini, where it's kind of like you can envision showing it to someone and then being like, oh, I want to try that. That looks cool, even though it might not be a game that they would ordinarily gravitate to otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's this weird juxtaposition that's throwing it off for me, I think. I'm trying to figure out what it is that threw me off about this game. And I think it is the juxtaposition of such a nice production versus a game that just didn't feel like it was deserving of it, for lack of a better term. Like, Santorini is a very nice production, but I think Santorini is a much better game.
Yes.
And there was something about like this one looking so good and then it just like kind of falling flat. Just, I think, especially threw me off. It's sort of like that heightened expectation when it's like let down. You know, if this had looked plainer, maybe I would have thought more of it because there wasn't so much glitz going into it. But it was a thing where the high production, I think, hurt the game for me.
Yeah.
And that's not to say like a lower production game, if this had been lower production, I would have enjoyed it more because I just think it's like a okay game. But yeah, there's something like some disconnect there for me.
I get that. It is interesting. Like in the context of like photosynthesis, I thought that was a game where because of how fiddly it was, I was more irritated by the high production values. The idea that it doesn't justify its table presence mechanically. But for me, Mark, I'm just going to continue to bask in Bosk.
Nice. Very clever of you.
Thank you.
Come up with that.
That is Bosk by Floodgate Games.
All right, Kellen, what did you play?
Yeah, so the game that Christina and I had a chance to play this past week was Spies Lies, a Stratego Story. So this game comes to us from Don Eskridge, and careful listeners will remember... I don't know if careful listeners remember things, but remember that I was seeking to acquire a copy of this game a few episodes back, and I have since purchased a copy, and Don Eskridge is the designer of The Resistance, one of our favorite board games ever. And then the second thing I want to point out is that the name of this is Spies and Lies, which is an amazing title for a thing. And I went to the internet to find out if it has ever been used before, and it has in 2010 as a TV movie. So this should not be confused with the 2010 TV movie based on the book The Plot to Subvert Wartime New Zealand, but is in fact based on the Stratego franchise. This is a 2-player bluffing deduction game that I would say is probably closest to like a coup-like game, but for 2 players in a way that works really well. Essentially, you have none of the placement that you would find in a game of Stratego or a game of Lord of the Rings Confrontation. You have one center piece that is being pushed and pulled back and forth, and if you get that piece to their castle and then one place further, you win the game. And how do you move that piece, you might ask? Well, every round of the game, you will lay down soldiers from 1 to 9, and you get to choose 4 of them, and you place them into mission slots. And they must be placed in ascending order. So if you want to use the number 1, it has to go in the far left. If you want to use the number 10, it has to go in the far right. The only conceit there is that the 4 can be played anywhere you want it to. And so you're going to actually be trying to guess what position other players have put their soldiers in. And so each soldier has an ability. So you will place all 4 down. You might put it in order of 2, 4, 3, 9. right? And so you could already see where the deduction could come from, because what will happen is a random card will be flipped over, and that card says 1, 2, 3, 4. And you actually have to put on top of the cards where a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4 exist. You have to put a token on top of that so that they know that card is either 1, 2, 3, or 4. Again, with the only exception being on the 4, you're allowed to just bluff the out of it. So if you have a 4, you can put it on there, or you cannot. And then you take turns. Basically, in mission 1, I try to call what you have under that mission slot. And if I call it, it doesn't get to activate. And if I'm wrong, it gets to activate. And each one has a special power. The special powers will kill other units that haven't come up yet. They will move the center line back and forth. In addition to the center line, you have sort of this thing that you're banking power on, 1 to 10. And once it gets to 10, that moves the center line 1 further. There are pieces that just move the center line directly. There are pieces that once that line gets to 10, if you scored 8 points on your side line, it doesn't go back. It just goes back to 0. So you've wasted that energy. But one special power is that, it actually loops around. That is almost the entirety of the game. The only other thing that's hilarious and very fun to do is right before someone guesses, if you're convinced that that they have no idea what it is, you can double down on it and say, you're not going to get this, which is such a fun thing to do in a 2-player deduction game. I will say that this made Christina livid. If you've ever had a bad experience playing a deduction game or a bluffing game where it just goes completely sideways and completely wrong, this may annoy you, because you have the potential for that to happen, where I just knew what she was up to and she could not figure out what I was up to. And then in subsequent rounds, some of the soldiers that you've used will be face up discarded. So you know, okay, I know Nealon doesn't have the 9 to use for this round. I was super charmed by this, all the way from a production down to a gameplay, decision-making. It was just light and fun. It is hard to acquire. I did have to order it from Amazon Germany, Amazon DE. Is that what DE is?
Yep.
Deutschland.
Stupid American guy, Gene. Knows nothing about his country codes. What questions do you guys have about Spies and Lies, a Stratego story? I think making it Stratego-themed
seems so arbitrary. Like, why? I mean, I guess there's power in the name, right?
Well, there's a hidden thing. There's a hidden aspect. Speaking of names, though, the name that sort of jumped out at me when you described it sort of feels like a fleshed out love letter. Is there anything to that idea?
Yeah, I think I abhor love letter.
Okay.
Let me just say that out loud, which is probably why I go to Coup as the reference point.
Right.
It's like, let's play a little game of love letter, and you think it's going to be 10 minutes long, and then it's like 2 hours long, and you're like, oh my God.
2 hours long? What kind of love letter?
Put this game away, Mark.
Love letter 2 hours. You've been playing love letter wrong.
Yeah, it's a round-based game. People love this There's Batman love letter, okay?
I know. No, I know.
There's Hobbiton love letter,
Isn't there
okay?
there's like a Marvel Infinity Gauntlet love letter. That's what
yeah,
I
I
was
wish
gonna
I
get for
knew
you for
more of
Christmas.
them, because I'd love to say okay. Adventure Time? Star Wars? Can you imagine Everdell love letter? There isn't, but could you imagine? Yes. So I think that as a frame of reference for people who might be familiar with Stratego, I was annoyed because it doesn't have any of the trappings of the spatial part of Stratego that I think really gives Stratego its teeth. I wonder if some of the powers, and I'm not super familiar with Stratego, of like the spy or the bomb, they may actually translate a little bit thematically. I'm not the guy to be able to answer that question. But I would like to play this with both of you, and I think you will enjoy it. I think that the largest criticism that many will probably levy at this game is that you set your array of 4, and then a card is flipped that says, reveal if any of these are 4, 5, or 6, reveal if any of these are 7, 8, 9. And that can feel kind of random, LOL, like now I have to reveal too much.
Right.
And there was one time, I believe, where Christina had to reveal all 4, were one of those 4, and it's just like, what? It's so frustrating. But again, even within that, with just that 4 being there or not there, there's a lot that you can do. And as the round goes, it is fun to try to figure out if you're just going to try to get to your 10 or if you're going to start using some of those special powers to really impact the game. That is Spies and Lies, a Stratego story. I can't even say that with a straight face. It's so good. Spies and Lies, that's a 10 out of 10 name.
It's a great name.
A Stratego Story? What is it? A storybook?
I mean, it shares the name with my favorite, what was it, film about New Zealand war?
The TV movie from 2010?
Yeah, I remember that one. That was really good.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
I was really into that one. It was about New Zealand.
Wartime.
Wartime in New Zealand, one of my favorite subjects. Right up there. Anyway, I played a game with a colon, too, Kellen. We were like gaming buddies in that way.
Oh, no.
But I played Glen More II, Chronicles. This is the latest version, I guess, of the classic Glen More by Matthias Kramer. Whereas Glen More, the original, was a relatively small box game, Glen More II is a beast. And it's a beast because of that aforementioned Chronicles part of it. The way the Chronicles aspect works is that you have the base Glen More II game, and then there are 8 what are referred to as Chronicles that are sort of different modules that you can add to the game. I think you can play with multiple modules if you want, but we played base Glen More II. So I can't speak too much to the Chronicles. The way that Glen More II works is, in a lot of ways, in its basic trappings, it is a pretty generic Euro game. It's got the get the resources, convert the resources, but it has a lot of twists which make it quite a bit different. The way that you will be taking your actions is there is sort of like a rondel, which is the center board of the game, and it'll be filled with tiles. And if you want a tile, you take your pawn and you move it to the tile you want. The next player to act is always the one who's in the back. Takedo. So it's got that thing where there's a tile way up front. I really, really like it. I'm going to go up and grab it, but that's at the cost of having my opponents potentially take a bunch of moves, which is
Takedo style.
What's that?
Takedo style.
I would call it Francis Drake style, but yes, Takedo style for the whole.
Let's not fight over that, though. Probably Takedo style. we could re-record.
Edit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been
post-production.
Yeah, I would say, okay.
Cut and paste.
Can you say the word Takedo for me?
Takedo. And I'll just put that in there. You're going to be moving around this board, grabbing the tiles, and sort of increasing the size of your, I know there's a Scottish word for this territory, but your territory. And whenever you place a tile down onto your tableau, you'll activate that tile and all tiles around it. So if the tile you bring down produces grain, you will put a grain on that tile, and then every single tile around it will produce. That may be producing resources, or it may allow for conversions, like every time this tile activates, convert a wheat to a whiskey, that kind of thing. So there's sort of an interesting comboing factor there. There's a spatial comboing. You want to leave sort of gaps where you want to place things to have them sort of activate. In addition to that part of the spatial aspect of the game, you also have meeples on this tableau that you're building, and you can only place tiles to grow your tableau if you have a meeple near it. So one of the actions that are on these tiles is a movement point, and so you can use those movement points to move your meeples to the areas on the tableau where you want to grow out. So you can't just simply place the tile you acquire anywhere you want. You have to have a meeple near that edge or near that part of the board. So that's an interesting sort of twist on tableau building. I think the most unique aspect of the game comes with its scoring. So there are 4 rounds to the game. There's an A, B, C, D round, and the tiles are tiered so that the structural tiles are the A tiles, and the more like big victory point tiles are the D tiles, which is something I always like when games have like a sort of a tiered deck. But at the end of every round, you'll be scoring. And the way scoring works is very interesting. There are 4 main aspects that you're scoring: number of meeples on your board, number of whiskey barrels you have, there's number of specific locations you've gone to. So there's these 4 criteria every single round. And the way it works is you'll identify which of your opponents have the fewest of that commodity, and then the difference between you and them determines how many points you score. So for example, if we're looking at whiskey scoring at the end of a round, and I have 1, and Neelan has 3, and Kellen has 5, I will not be scoring because I'm last. Neelan will be scoring 3 minus 1, so 2, and whatever the 2 is worth, he'll get that many points. And then Kellen will score 5 minus my 1 for 4, and whatever that's worth, that'll be his scoring. So it encourages you to try to specialize in something, but also try to make sure you're also balanced, because if you're not balanced, you're going to let that one player who's like accruing a bunch of things score a bunch of points. But if you're not specializing, you're not going to be able to get enough wiggle room to score big points. You want to like jump out ahead at something.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It immediately makes me think, and we're going to be getting to Mr. Uwe later, like what would happen if you just put that scoring system in Agricola?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
definitely.
It immediately makes things weirdly like, oh, you're taking carrots? Like,
right.
You. Like, no matter what anyone does.
Yeah, you're looking over and you're like, wait, how many sheep do you have? What are you doing with all the sheep? And so it's that same thing with Glen More II. You see somebody start to like pick a bunch of like whiskey production. And you're like, what are you doing? Like, now I've got to do something to make sure you don't get a bunch of points. And so that's basically how it works. It is, like I said, a huge box. There's a lot of pieces, but the game goes really fast, which actually sort of blew me away because it is a big table presence. It's got a lot of stuff going on. But I think our game, including Teach, was something like an hour long. It was really, really fast. Now, we did play with this variant in the rules that has a dummy player, and the dummy player really isn't doing anything except for taking tiles off the board to make the game faster. I was concerned the game was going to take a long time, so I played with that variant, and I think people generally encourage you to play with that variant, and that might have been a reason why it went so fast, but I would do it again because it's such a brisk game. It works really, really well. And so again, like I said, there are these variants that come to the box and you can add them and each have a different theme. Like one is a haggis theme thing where like now haggis is being produced, and one is a seafaring one where now you have like these little ship pieces. So there seems to be quite a bit of variety in the box. And generally, like Callan, I'm not really big into modules, but this seems like it's done in maybe an unobtrusive way. And so I'm interested in giving it a shot. So yeah, I really did enjoy my first couple plays of Glen More II.
There's something about the way this is packaged, and this is, funny enough, something that Shut Up and Sit Down referenced on a recent podcast, which is just the idea that these are packaged into boxes that have like a order to them. The idea is appealing to me of like, okay, next time we play this, we're going to open box A and add that to the game and see what that does. Like there is something about that sense of discovery of working through the modules that makes that so much more interesting to me and just so much more like appealing, even though it's just a production choice versus, oh, there are 8 expansions, there are 8 variants in the box, pick whichever ones you want and try them out. Some of them are cool, some of them may not be. Do you have some sort of sense that there is like some consensus around which of the Chronicles are good, which ones are bad, which ones are worth always having in?
I do not have a sense of that. I will say that there isn't any sense of sort of like campaign. There isn't a sense of like going from 1 to 8 in sequential order and sort of like try one, try the other, see what you like. I will also say that you have to sort of put these boxes together yourself when you open up the box. And so I know exactly what's in there. And
sure,
the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's not very many components to each package. So I think adding a module and taking it out would be quite simple. And I don't think it would make probably, again, I haven't played with any of them. It doesn't seem like it would make a drastic change. So again, like I said, unobtrusive feels like maybe a way to describe it.
Interesting.
It's funny because my research on this game came in our last draft, which we will be announcing the winner to shortly, when I drafted Glen More II. And I actually, in doing the research, I think that our ethos will actually have us enjoying Glen More I more, because it's basically a tighter, meaner, just a little bit less open-ended version of Glen More II, and without the modules. I know Neelan says he likes them, but like I abhor them, generally speaking. I really dislike them. I see what he's saying. If you have the same group playing a Euro game, it's great to have that variety.
Exactly. I also totally understand what you're saying, Kellen. Like in our scenario where we just want to get to the refined experience as fast as possible, what we would most advocate to most people is like, from a design perspective, tell us what you think the definitive experience is. It's hard not to look at Glen More II as Glenmore, but with more stuff bolted onto it.
Yep. Well, and it's like, we're total side tangent. Do we have a side tangent alert, Mark, sound that you could play?
Yeah, I put it in. I edited it in there.
Oh, total side tangent. Can it be me saying that, but like faster? Total side tangent.
No, it is.
Total side tangent. We're trying to play Cyclades, which feels like a complete absence from our area control knowledge base. And you can play it with Hades. You can play it with Titans. You can play it with certain modules. You can play it on the base map. You can play it on the Titans map. And people argue a lot about which one of those is the best. And it's like, well, I'm not going to commit to 17 games of this using all of these variants.
Right.
I want to know what's good. What's good?
That's fair.
Okay, and then like an end side tangent, end side tangent, end side tangent.
But sped it up a little bit, right?
Yeah, I am a fast talker, so.
That's true.
It's from my days in the city.
Your days as the Micro Machine spokesman. You get that reference? Look it up on YouTube.
About New Zealand?
So that is Glen More II by Matthias Kramer. All right, before we move on to talking about Uwe, let's talk about the winner of our last draft. This was from a couple episodes ago. We drafted the games from the BGG games ranked 201 to 300. And the winner of your votes was Mr. Orange Shank himself, Neelan, with 42.3% of the votes. Kellen followed that up with 32% of the votes. And I was a strong third with 25.8%.
I can't believe you doubted me and made me doubt myself in the process.
Well, I mean, if I'm not going to win, then at least I can put self-doubt into your mind. I'll take that. I'll take psychological harm, at the very least.
I have two important additions, and these are not side tangents, so don't add that noise right here.
Right.
Number one, after 24 hours, we had hundreds of votes, and I was literally tied with Neelan. So amongst our most diehard listeners, I issue a sincere thank you.
Amongst our most sort of, quick to the draw, make rash, brash, easy decisions, but the people that took the time, Kellen, the people that really deliberated and got to the heart of the issue, they came after me in the end.
And number two, that's not a side tangent. I think I could be misremembering, so please help me, that I have never gotten last in this, but I've also never gotten first.
Yes, you are Mr. Second Place. You are the perennial Silver Award winner.
Don't call me that.
You are not top of the podium, but you're not at the bottom. You're right in the middle of the podium.
Mark, you have to call me Mr. Second Place.
You have ascended to the top, but only in that circumstance. So we randomly selected somebody who voted at boardgamebarrage.com/draft. Your email starts with the letter F, ends with the letter T at gmail.com, and we will be emailing you shortly for that $50 gift certificate at the online retailer of your choice. I think we had a overseas winner, didn't we, Kellen, recently?
Yes, and then doing that conversion almost killed me.
But we came through.
Yes, we had a winner from Australia that actually picked a online retailer that we had not heard of, Advent Games, out of Australia. And the owner, Dean, actually listens to the podcast. So that was really cool to reach out to him and then try to do the math, converting $50 US to Australian dollars. It was a whole thing because they call them dollars too.
How dare they?
Yeah, where did they get off?
Australia is the scene of my favorite sequel, though. Spies Lies 2 takes place in Australia. Big hit.
Wartime.
Big hit down under, yeah. So the next time we do a draft, you can vote from anywhere. You might get $50 or kroner or euros or, well, equivalent. I guess you wouldn't get 50 euros. We're definitely not going to give you 50 euros because the euro is stronger. But yeah, you'll get 50 equivalent of whatever your currency is if you are the winner. So vote next time, which is not helpful now because we have no draft to vote on. Also, before we move on, a quick shout out to those in Southern California that we are going to be at the Strategicon convention this weekend. So it is the weekend of September 3rd through the 6th. We are going to be there off and on throughout the convention, but we are definitely going to be there on the 4th, which is the day of the math trade / virtual flea market. That is going to be happening in the morning, and we are going to be available starting at give or take noon. I think we're going to be around for a lot of the rest of the convention, but we'll certainly be there for Saturday from noon on. So if you're in town and you're interested in coming to the convention, please come on out, and we would love to meet and potentially play games with you. I will be carrying my pack of Biblios, of course, so there's always that happening. And yeah, find out more information at strategicon.net. And we'll also be discussing this, I think, on our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord in the conventions channel. So there'll be more discussion about it there.
Yeah, I think especially if you want to set up some games in advance, that would be a good place to organize them, get people together. The conventions and meetups channel in our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord.
All right, let's get into our feature discussion. This is Designer Series Part 3, Uwe Rosenberg.
Eat your vegetables.
Mr. Vegetables, Mr. Starvation himself. So let's start off with a little bit of backstory about Uwe, and then we'll get into his games. He is German, and he went to school for statistics. I guess he was a graduate with a degree in statistics. And then upon graduating, he had, I guess, a job offer and was also torn by the idea of becoming a game designer. And I guess the statistics job market was so robust that he figured that he could try this game designing for a couple of years, and if it didn't work out, he could go back and get a job in statistics because there was so much demand. So thankfully, he elected to get a degree in something where jobs were just falling out of trees, or else we would never have gotten all the sheep and barley conversions that we have today. So when it came to designing his first couple of games, he was playing around trying to figure out something to design. He was big into games, obviously. And he was speaking to a friend who was in, I guess, publishing. And this person told him that the latest hotness in gaming was going to be card games. And so he set his mind to the idea of like creating a card game. And the card game that he created, it wasn't his first design, but it was obviously his first big design, was Bohnanza. And he said this was inspired by, of all things, Francis Tresham's Civilization, as well as Alan Moon's game called, I think, Freight Train. He loved playing these huge games, and Civilization is this massive, massive game. But the part of Civilization that he liked the best was at the end of like every phase, and Civilization every round is like 15 phases, but one of the later phases in Civilization is this card trading phase, and he liked the idea of like this trading action, so he sort of glommed onto that and built it into the game Bohnanza. And people, obviously a lot of times they will comment. For those who don't know, Bohnanza is a game about trading beans. Bahn is German for bean, and it's a game all about...
I thought it was German for ugly art.
It's all about trading beans and planting beans. Have you guys played Bohnanza? What do you guys think of Bohnanza?
I have played Bohnanza. It is funny because Kellen reminded me about the art that for whatever reason, it just like distresses me a little bit. It's kind of, I know that it's not like anywhere close to this, but it's got like in my memory, it's got like a sort of a Garbage Pail Kids kind of thing where I'm unsettled by it. I don't know why that is. Anyway, Bohnanza, I think it's a game that I've been wanting to return to. I remember playing it very, very early in my introduction to the hobby. And it obviously gets so much love as one of Uwe's like classic games. Like it's a game that is like revolves around negotiation and trading, and like it's just a fun, simple card game.
I think the ability to not switch the placement of the cards in your hand and having to deal with them as they sit is so fascinating and underexplored, even to this day. I wish I liked Bohnanza more than I do, because I feel like it has all the ingredients of something I would like, but unfortunately I just don't like beans for whatever reason.
That's crazy. I do like Bohnanza. It's one of those games where, sort of like Codenames, it's a game that I've played a bunch of times and I always think I'm sort of sick of, and it's very plain, and it's got, like Nealon said, the sort of weirdly grotesque art, but every time I play it, I enjoyed it, and I usually it's a case where the table is all sort of into it as well. So, and I think I've heard that in Germany, Bohnanza is like a game that's sort of ever present. Like it's at like drugstores and stuff. It's like you can get a pack of playing cards, or you can get Bohnanza. It's like all over the place. Or maybe it was. Maybe I'm wrong by that. Maybe German listeners will let me know if that is correct or incorrect. But when I heard that, I had this vision of like going to a gas station in Germany and like walking into the convenience store and like pack of gum, cigarettes, Bohnanza. So that's the image I've had in my head, and I'm hoping that's correct.
It's funny, for whatever reason, what sticks out to me is that in the original printing of Bohnanza, you have crop fields, and there was a way to upgrade to get a third crop field, but it was kind of a newbie trap strategy that like barely usually didn't work, to the point that now in recent printings, they don't even include the third crop field. And there's just something so interesting to me about the balance of like, maybe 5% of the time it ends up working out and being a good strategy, but because like so many people do it and just lose, they're like, we don't need it in this game. And I love thinking about little things like that.
And so from Bohnanza, he created a whole bunch of games. Bohnanza was in 1997 and created a bunch of games, and then I guess went to a convention, and in the booth next to him was a new game that was just coming out called Caelus. And so he got a copy of Caelus, and he said he played it like 2 weeks straight every night. He would just play it and play it and play it and play it, and absolutely loved it. At some point, it definitely was his favorite game of all time. I think it's probably changed now, but he said it was one of his favorite games of all time. And from that worker placement of Caelus were planted the germs that would become his, I think, magnum opus, or I guess not magnum opus, his like quintessential first hit, Agricola. I guess Caelus, I think, came out around 2005, and that's when he started working on Agricola, but he wouldn't release it for 2 years. It didn't come out for 2 years. And from what I have read and heard about the designing of Agricola, it was just a situation where he just loved playing it. Even this prototype version, and he would just play it over and over again, and he would create these cards. And Agricola is known for having all these, occupation cards that you can select from, and that was to a great degree a function of just his like passion for it and just the way he sort of dove into it. Agricola is, I think, when people talk about Uwe Rosenberg, is probably the first game they think of. And Agricola is famous for being the game that knocked Puerto Rico off of its perch as the number one game on BGG. So Agricola took over from Puerto Rico, which had had the crown for a long time.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't have the historical rankings, but I do remember Puerto Rico and it just fighting for dominance, and it would like switch back and forth on the list. And I distinctly remember bringing Agricola to college in 2008. So I guess, wow, I was on the cutting edge because I graduated high school in 007. Every prom in 2007 was 007. That's true. That's a fact. Look that up, Mark. You can look that up. And went to college and tried to play Agricola with 3 newbies who'd never played another board game because I was like, well, it's the best game. It's one of the best games there is. And just, it was so heavy. I was just like, what the have I gotten into?
Right.
Agricola has been a regular placement in my top 50 list as well. Not maybe as early as Kellen did by a mile, but it was also a game that was one of my first introductions into heavy board gaming. And I distinctly remember that first game and that sense of being overwhelmed by it. And I've spoken about this in the context of other heavy games, where sometimes I will play a heavy game and like, despite feeling overwhelmed, just have this intense feeling that, man, that was something so novel and so cool that I sort of immediately felt like I had to play it again, despite its weight, despite how completely out of my depth I was at that point in the hobby. Agricola was so novel to me, and this is at a point in time where, I've barely played a worker placement game. So it's just like a revelation to me. And the idea that the tension that you have over starvation and keeping your family alive, it's good. It's so good.
It's hard not to speak about it without some of the later games on the list, but Agricola really is from an era where we had not lost the plot of what it meant to be a worker placement game, which is that the plot is to try to block spaces from other players. We've evolved worker placement because it's been so seen that now the plot of a worker placement game is, what to do in spite of the worker placement, or what can we add to worker placement, where Agricola in many ways is just quintessential. I block you, you can't get your read, go f yourself. And that's what made it amazing.
Thank you for that, Mr. Second Place.
No.
In traveling down his designography, I think the next big game is the one that he releases the very next year, Le Havre. I am a big fan of Le Havre. I like the aspect of it where you can use other people's buildings. I thought that was an interesting aspect. I also like how it works.
So good.
Yeah, and I also like how it works, I think, super well at all player counts. I think it works at 2 and 3 and 4. 4 maybe is a little long, but yeah, like you were saying, Kellen, or like you were agreeing with, I guess, Kellen, yeah, the fact that you can work on the buildings that haven't been built or your opponent's building, and you can just sit there on your opponent's building and restrict their access to get back on it. I just always thought that was a really interesting aspect.
Well, and you get paid, right, if they come to your building.
Right.
So it has that thing that I love in Keyflower. It's like, I want the most desirable building, so everyone has to come round.
Right.
And it's just so amazing. I think what Le Havre for me is actually, I have it written down here. I don't know when we talk about what, because Mark's running this poorly running ship. But
speaking of Le Havre,
this is the one that I wish I had played much more of.
Yeah.
It has this feeling of economic board game, like interlaced into it with loans and cascading outward economies of resources. And it's like, I've spent a lot of time in Agricola land, and I really wish I had more love for Le Havre. And I think, and who knows with Mr. Vassal these days, but Le Havre sits in his top 10, and a lot of times has been in the number 1 placement. I don't know where it is now, where other games have risen and fallen. And I really think it's underappreciated now, and it is a little bit of a bear. Everyone has invested in baby food jars to store all the resources on the board because it's so annoying. But this is one that I need to revisit more of and really feel like I have missed the mark on my own exposure to it.
It's got that same sort of thing with Agricola where, when a spot in Agricola, you start accumulating all the wood and you're like, you know what, I don't even need wood, but there's so much wood on that spot, I got to take it. But in Agricola, you feel like, okay, if I take it though, I might get really messed up because I didn't take the thing I really needed. Whereas Le Havre, it's not that tight, but there is that thing where oh my God, there's so much coal there. I don't need coal, but I just got to take it because there's so much that's accumulated. That's a positive feeling aspect of the game that I've always enjoyed. After Le Havre came Gates of Loyang. I don't know if you guys have played that. He referred to that as one of his hardest games for him to design early on. It's a game that I've played once. I think it's primarily best at, I think, 2 players. But yeah, I just remember it having a lot of like interesting aspects to it.
Yeah, I've also only played this once, and again, a very long time ago. And it's funny how, like, the one thing that stands in my memory of it is just kind of, again, that sort of, like, punishing, restrictive feel of it, but in a way that was invigorating, where, like, you played it once and you felt like, oh, I know what I would do differently next time immediately. I've been wanting to revisit this, especially given that it has been recently reprinted in a new edition. I definitely should try find some time to give that another go.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Gates of Loyang is about you being like a trader in the market, and you can acquire customers, but you have to supply them with what they want round after round, or if not, you get punished. So there is that sort of Agricola punishment thing. Another aspect I really like about Gates of Loyang is that you win based on the number of victory points you have at the end of the game, and the way that you get victory points is you buy them at the end of every round, and the first victory point is always $1, and the next victory point and every subsequent point is the amount of spots that you are up the victory point track. So for example, if you have 6 victory points, the next point costs you 1 at the end of the round, but now that you're on 7, to buy that second victory point costs you 8, and the next one costs you 9. It always struck me as like an interesting, clean way to make victory points hard to get. I guess the next big game that we should talk about is his biggest game. This is probably the one that I should have called his magnum opus. This is Neelan's favorite game of all time, Feast for Odin. A quick thing to talk about when it comes to Feast for Odin before diving into it is Feast for Odin was released in 2016. Patchwork was released in 2014, but Patchwork came out of the design of Feast for Odin. So for those who aren't familiar with either of the games, Patchwork is a polyomino game where you are placing sort of Tetris pieces on your board, trying to get the best fit, trying to grab the best pieces. And that aspect also is present in Feast for Odin, both in the way you sort of feed your people and also in the way that you're covering up spots on your board. Your board starts with a bunch of negative scoring spots, and you're trying to acquire pieces in order to cover them up to not get those negative points. And so in the designing of Feast for Odin, the story behind Feast for Odin is interesting because when it came to coming up with the idea, he went back to Agricola. Agricola's a game where it's famous for feeding your people. He thought that the idea of making the feeding aspect more clear, where a sheep was worth 2 and a boar was worth 3, making it actually like a tile piece that was like a 2x1 versus a 3x1. So that struck him as an interesting way to do the feeding. It was like more visual. And so that sort of became that polyomino aspect. And so as he was working on Feast for Odin, he had this polyominoes that he was playing around with. And from then he decided, okay, well, what if I put these polyominoes on a board? And then that's where Patchwork sort of like sprung from. And it's funny because he's very pragmatic about his designs. Like he knows he's sort of like making them for the audience. Like he keeps that in mind, but he has this sort of like prickly side to him where like he says that Patchwork is a game that while he's proud of it and, it took him hard work to make it, it's not a game that he would play. He said it's like too simple for him. It's not a game that he himself would enjoy. And yet, it's one of his highest selling games of all time.
Mark, can I say something?
Yes, you can, Mr. Second Place.
Oh, I don't know about... Okay. Are you familiar, Mark, with the concept... you got me all flustered. Are you familiar with the concept of time travel, Mark?
I am.
Because if I had a time machine, I would go back to the year 2013 and find the who showed Uwe Rosenberg Tetris and then ruined the next 10 years of output. You know that meme where we don't know the golden age when we're in it and then we look back on it?
Right.
We had it. You know what I mean? We had 2007 to 2013.
Right. And
then Tetris happened.
Do I have to be the time traveler that goes back in time to stop you? Because I love this era of games. I love polyomino games. I think I was so delighted to discover, which I hadn't realized, that Patchwork had sort of been born out of A Feast for Odin, because they're both 2 of my favorite games. I mean, there's a purity to Patchwork, which, to some extent, it's not always the first polyomino game I show people these days, not only because it's just very specific, it is a 2-player only game, but it is still just so clean as far as that placing polyominoes on a board goes. And then you marry that with the delightful timing system. It's a delight. And then what is there to say about A Feast for Odin that I haven't already said at some point in the past in the podcast? It's the way it takes that system and feeds so much into it. Like everything builds towards this tile building system, but it is such a rich, dense game that all is feeding into this one mechanic in sort of interesting ways depending on the specific actions you're taking. I can definitely sympathize to a position that I think Kellen has said multiple times, which is, this is the antithesis of the Agricola style of worker placement. Like, this is worker placement taken as broad and as open as possible, where you're not that heavily restricted by your opponents. Even if you get quote unquote blocked somewhere on the board, you still have 100 other places you could place your worker and take a productive turn. I think that the thing that lends, other than, we've spoken about how restrictive some of these games feel and how that is energizing. The energy I get from A Feast for Odin is this limitless wealth of possibilities before me, and just feeling like I'm sort of exploring a possibility space that's going to be different from game to game.
I've got one word for you. Legos.
That's what I should be doing instead?
Yep. With you and the other 6-year-old.
So I guess if you have a time machine on your way to kill Hitler, you can go back to, 2013 or whatever, and then decide whether or not you're going to let Kellen stop Uwe from watching Tetris. Or
every 3 years or so, Neelan convinces me to play A Feast for Odin again, like out of the sheer bombacity with which he espouses it, and I get disappointed. I actually think Patchwork is quite good. There's something odd to me about using polyominoes as like it's like, again, like A Feast for Odin, the plot is not worker placement or polyominoes. It's just more and more, where Patchwork is just like, it's this amazing like time puzzle of one economy versus your board placement, and the board is the game. And in A Feast for Odin, I can't quite tell if I'm bad at it because I don't get the efficiencies that are going on, or if I'm bad at placing pieces spatially. And I'm not even sure that being good at placing pieces spatially is advantageous for you in A Feast for Odin. And I'm sure it is, because that's a dumb thing to say, but at the same time, it's like there's so much more to it that I wouldn't say that that's one of the top 3 or 4 skills that you need to compete in A Feast for Odin.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would think based on my experience with it, it is a core part of it, but it's not going to be the defining factor in your ability at A Feast for Odin, for sure.
Yeah. I think just shifting gears a little, Mark, what's so funny is that you have a game, we say, here are the notable things, and then you have a game like Caverna, right, which sort of took the board game world by storm in 2013 as like this is Agricola, but better because it's got magic and it's got more and more and more in it. And, like the people defending Caverna versus Agricola, I think has largely died down in the intervening years. Still many people who probably prefer it to Agricola, but I don't think it had the staying power that like it felt like it had at that time. Because in that day, it was like, this is Agricola, but better.
Right.
Is really the talk track when that came out.
I would agree on that. Yeah, absolutely. So there was Feast for Odin, and then there was his run of polyomino games, which included Cottage Garden, and then Indian Summer, and then Spring Meadow. And then I think he was playing games at his sister's place or sister-in-law's place, who I guess isn't a big gamer, but she said there was a game that she really enjoyed. This game was Habitats by Corne von Morsel. And that game is what inspired Nova Luna, which sort of harkens a little bit. I'm not super familiar with Habitats, but does feel a little bit like the Patchwork timing thing. It's got the timing aspect that you have with Patchwork. And so this is sort of an aspect of his design that has reoccurred over and over again. With Bohnanza, his first big hit, it was a take on Tresham civilization. And then with Agricola, it was a take on Caelus. And then with Feast for Odin was actually sort of a take on Agricola initially. And then from that came out Patchwork. And then Nova Luna was a take on Habitat. So he's also iterative, and any sort of big game designer who's done a lot of games is going to be iterative. But I think his iteration is sort of different than the designers that we've talked about in the past, where he seems to glom onto a mechanism and go from there. He was talking about his design of Agricola, and he loved Caelus, but he didn't understand why the economy of workers was static, because he would say early in Caelus, you have a number of workers, and early on, you don't know what to do with the last couple because there's nothing really you want to do. You just sort of use them for no reason. And then later in Caelus, like now you want more workers than you even have. And so that's why the family growth was a part of Agricola. So he finds these mechanisms, and he's a designer, unlike some of the ones we talked about, that does start with a mechanism. He sees either something in another game that he likes but doesn't like other aspects of the game and tries to fine-tune it, or in his own games, and then goes from there. He doesn't go from, like Wallace generally wants a theme and then works from there. With Rosenberg, he's more of let me find the mechanism and then put a theme on it that works. He said repeatedly the theme is important to him and he wants to make sure that there's a coherence between them, but he doesn't work from theme, he works from mechanisms. And Nova Luna led to Sagani, which is a take on Nova Luna. And then just recently he has sort of returned to his farming nature with Hallertau, which was his latest big box from 2020. A game that it's funny, I've said this on the show, but that first time when we opened up Hallertau and it was like, oh, this is old Uwe. Like I felt a sense of like comfort. You know, I saw all the like animeebles and all the green of the fields and the brown of the dirt where you would be planting these fields, and it just felt super comfortable. It's a game that after a couple of plays, I wasn't the biggest fan of. I still would play it. I still enjoy it, but I think so the card draw is a little on the lucky side. But yeah, what do you guys think of some of his later designs?
I think one of the things I find interesting about a designer like Uwe is when I think about his games, you touched on this a little bit with your comparison to Wallace, where, you know, when we were talking about the way to like thread the needle on Wallace and like what the similarity between these games are, you're kind of talking more broadly. The idea that they're more esoteric, that they have this sort of maybe some sort of shared motifs to them, but it's so much more granular and specific with Uwe. It's like, okay, here is the third or the fourth in a series of games that uses farming, that uses worker placement, that uses polyominoes, that uses the patchwork timing system. It's like he has these building blocks of mechanics that he's comfortable with, and what he loves to do is find ways to work those together into a way that just doesn't quite feel like the other ones. And I think one of the ways that this is the most clearly illustrated, to me at least, is in that trilogy of the polyomino games, like Cottage Garden, Spring Meadow, and Indian Summer. On the surface, you could say, okay, these are just three games that are going to feel very similar. They're all about laying tiles, but he somehow makes them feel very distinct. Like, while using extremely similar components and extremely similar systems, they have a completely different feel to them because of the different ways that he combines those elements. And it's kind of why whenever a new Uwe game rolls around, I sort of have this curve on it where it doesn't on the outset, from the outside, look like something that's exciting because it looks familiar. You know, like you said about Hallertau, what your reaction to Hallertau was almost a little bit in the reverse to me, where I saw that and I was like, oh, I think I've seen this before. But then only once you engage with it, do you realize how he's using all those pieces differently.
It's funny, I think when I think of doing word associations with Uwe Rosenberg, the first thing that comes to mind is like resource conversion.
Yeah.
And when I think of resource conversion, I feel like everyone has learned the wrong lesson from Uwe Rosenberg, which is just like sort of the Century Spice Road thing where there's 1,000 machines and no matter what you do, you can throw them in and different colored gems will come out. And it's like this loose gems sort of thing. And then you compare that with the best of Uwe's resource conversion, and it's agonizing to try to get just enough of that resource you need to get it, or you're one piece of wood away from building, the perfect building that you need. Even in Baby Agricola, the 2012 Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small is another one that I really like. And he takes this sort of resource conversion system in that game and then puts it in Nusfjord, where the abilities are on the buildings themselves that you're trying to acquire and use in your sort of tableau. And so it's fun seeing those little connection points. But I think of resource conversion done right, which I don't know that even extends to his polyomino era. But once we take care of that man with the Game Boy, we won't even have that era. Then we can edit this episode.
One quick thought I was interested to get your guys' take on, because I've had this idea in my head for a while where Uwe does the two-player version of Agricola and the two-player version of Caverna, and I keep wondering, because in my head, like, A Feast for Odin was the evolution of those two games specifically, what a two-player specifically streamlined version of A Feast for Odin could look like. And I don't know if that is possible, but I would just love to see him try because it's like so absurd. But yeah, like what you would have to throw out, like, like take half that board away and just like get down to like the tile laying and like some of the actions. I don't know. I would love to see him try.
Feast for Odin duel.
Yes, exactly.
No, it's a dinner for Odin.
Yes. That's right. But it did get me thinking, like, because in some ways I think that Uwe lends himself to this discussion more than others in terms of like, what would you like to see him iterate on next? Like, what game of his would you like to see him take another swing at?
It is just stuck in my head that he has one of the only memory games in existence that people like. And he made a game back in the day in like 1999, Mamma Mia, which is like this pizza memory game that I have not played, but it's a memory game and like critics like it. And I'm just like, what could it be?
Yeah, I've heard.
You know, that's
about
what
that.
I think.
Yeah, I've never played
exactly.
I've heard good things.
But it's a memory game,
Right.
So that's what he needs to bring back.
I guess for me, I like the comboing aspects of Nusfjord. The way that the buildings combo Nusfjord, like at the beginning of the game, you have all these buildings out there, and you sort of trying to figure out, okay, if I got this, and then I got this, then they combo in a really interesting way. Maybe that would be the take I'd like to see him expound on.
Anyone have any Uwe games on their shelf of shame? I have one.
I have Glass Road. I have not played Glass Road, and I have that.
I have a Bargain Hunter, which is like
Oh.
a trick-taking game that like I've read the rules like 4 times and somehow I cannot grasp this thing. I don't know.
That is an oldie, but hopefully goodie. I've not played it.
You know, I kind of respect heritage.
Yeah, you are very big into respecting your elders, Mr. Second Place. And that's going to do it on our retrospective on Uwe Rosenberg. We have not even touched really on a lot of his big hits, Fields of Arle, New York Zoo, Glass Road. So,
Or at Labora.
That's a
Mark.
huge one. Yeah, that was dumb of me not to mention. So let us know what you think of Uwe, maybe what your favorite Uwe game or your favorite Uwe mechanism at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Our podcast channel there is where we talk about the latest episode. So why not hop in there and discuss your favorite Rosenberg games or mechanisms. If you want to reach out to us, besides the Discord, where there is a ton of board gaming chat going on 24 hours a day, you can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can write us at the Guild at boardgamebarrage.com/guild. You can find us on all forms of social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, et al. You can find us in person at Strategicon this weekend. More information at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord in the conventions channel. Big thank you to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? Otherwise, we'll either see you this weekend or talk to you next week. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
I'm hot. I'm ready. I want you to save me from myself.
Then followed up with Martin Wallace. And today we are going to the farming man
Catch
himself.
a falling Wallace.
And today we are going... It sort of just hit a weird spot where it was like pretty...
Mark.
Yep.
Mark,
Yes.
have I taught you idiots nothing?
What's that?
What have I always said is the most important thing? Wordplay.
Okay.
Bask in Bosk. It's one letter, Mark.
But I'm not basking in Bosk.
In Bosk. All you're doing, you're drooling over the oh, it's so beautiful. You're basking, Mark.
But I'm not...
It's one letter away. It's one squiggle away from the O to the A to bask in Bosk, okay?
All right.
All right, I'll leave now.
It's table presence
Right.
mechanically.
And Neelan, now you need to end it by saying, but for me, I'm just going to bask in the beauty of Bosk.
Okay,
And then-
perfect.
And then, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. But
But don't make it a thing.
No.
Yeah.